Today I'd like to start a little series that kind of tells some stories from my career, and the purpose of this is really doesn't have anything to do with me, but I hope that the moral of the stories will help other people in their pursuit of their music career. This one deals with the topic of how chance influences our careers, and of course chance is of no effect if it's not also coupled with preparation. This is a good story about how those two things interact. Back in my very young days of a career, of course, like anyone just starting, I certainly didn't have an abundance of jobs nor an abundance of money. And one day, out of the clear blue sky, I get a call from the Latin Casino, which, though no one today probably remembers it, but at one time it was one of the biggest and best show places in the United States. Originally it was on Walnut Street in Philadelphia, but by the time I got involved it was in Cherry Hill, New Jersey on Route 38. In any case, this theater was home to the most famous acts of the time. This is where Sinatra would be, or Streisand would be, or Sammy Davis Jr., Billy Eckstine, Peggy Lee, all of those people. So obviously it was a pretty prime job. So what had happened was this call came in about 6 o'clock on, I believe it was a Monday night, and I remember distinctly that I was sitting there drinking a glass of something or other, watching a Phillies game, and when I realized it was the Latin calling, of course I was very enthused, because at that time that was really the most prestigious job around. So they said, would I like to do a show there for a 2-week period? And I said, sure, I'd be glad to. So I said, when's rehearsal? They said, well, you missed rehearsal. I said, oh, okay, well, when's the show? They said, in 2 hours. So I was in Pennsylvania, in Bryn Mawr, and this was over in Cherry Hill. So I threw a tuxedo on, tried to shave, cutting myself in my Volkswagen, grabbed a burger at McDonald's, and dashed over there to play the show. Well, somehow I survived that first show, which is always a tricky problem, and continued through the 2 weeks. The guitar player that I was replacing was named Joe Lano, and Joe was the top show player around at the time, and he had held the chair at the Latin for quite a while. So nobody had much of an idea that they would be getting the job, especially away from Joe. So I finished the 2 weeks, and I was in the contractor's office, and the phone rings, and it turns out to be Joe Lano. What had happened was the Latin had released Joe from the engagement that I played because the act said they were bringing their own guitar player. So normally the procedure was the Latin guitar player would be free to do something else. So Joe had taken a 2-week engagement in Las Vegas with Dinah Washington. And of course they had run out of every possible guitar player, and they got to the bottom of the list, and anybody know this kid named Chuck Anderson? And of course everybody said no, never heard of him. He goes, well, we're desperate. And that's why the call came into me, because I was the only person left on their list. So having survived it and in the office, and Joe calls, and to my amazement, Joe says, Dinah Washington just offered me a permanent job, and I also have been offered the permanent staff job at the Stardust in Vegas. So I'm not coming back to reclaim my chair at the Latin. So with that, the contractor looks to me and says, Joe Lano's staying in Vegas. He's not coming back. He said, considering how well you did on these 2 weeks, would you like the permanent guitar chair in the Latin Orchestra? So of course I said yes. It was by far the best, most lucrative and most prestigious job I had had to that point. And I continued playing there for the next 4 years. We did 14 shows a week with, I believe it was a Monday afternoon rehearsal. So it was very busy. But that's where I played for all the famous people that ultimately wound up on my resume. But I certainly wouldn't have wound up with those people or that experience on my resume without fortune meeting preparation.